There are moments in history not marked by the ticking of clocks or the swing of swords, but by the fire of truth spoken in just 60 seconds. A moment that doesn't just ripple, it roars. Dr. Jaishankar stood before the world and let loose words so fierce, so exact, so rooted in dignity that silence bowed and power blinked. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was thunder wrapped in calm. In that defining moment, when the cameras rolled and the world's attention sharpened, Jaishankar didn't rise to whisper comfort or conform to diplomatic niceties. He rose to ignite consciousness. His voice, calm yet commanding, carried centuries of resilience within it. It wasn't arrogance that laced his words, but conviction. A conviction rooted not in aggression, but in an unshakable truth. A truth so often diluted to appease those who once shaped the narrative. He did not ask for permission to speak his truth. He simply spoke it, and in doing so reclaimed space that had long been overshadowed by foreign tongues and Western lenses. There was thunder in his stillness, and fire in his composure. When he declared India's position, it wasn't just political commentary, it was a soul statement. One could feel the weight of colonized generations rising in his tone, not in anger, but in firm remembrance. He did not present India as a victim of its past, but as a victor of its presence. The world, used to scripted apologies and guarded gestures, wasn't prepared for this raw authenticity. And yet, Jaishankar didn't flinch. He didn't soften his truth to fit the fragile ears of the elite. Instead, he turned the room into a mirror, forcing every listener to see their reflection in the words they were not ready to hear. He reminded us that diplomacy doesn't have to be drenched in ambiguity. It can be sharp, clear, and still dignified. For decades, India had been expected to nod politely, while others dictated the tempo. But here, in these 60 seconds, he flipped the rhythm. He spoke not as a subordinate power or a silent participant in global affairs, but as an equal, no, as a leader with something vital to say. The power of that moment didn't lie in volume or aggression. It lay in the stillness between his words, in the knowledge that he was speaking from a place of earned strength. He did not need to shout over others to be heard. His voice, laced with calm intensity, carried farther than fury ever could. And what made it all the more extraordinary was the knowledge that he wasn't speaking for himself. His voice carried the weight of 1,000,000,000 dreams, the stories of freedom fighters, the strength of farmers, scientists, teachers, and artists, who had built a modern India from the ashes of colonial rule. He stood not as a politician seeking applause, but as a custodian of their legacy. Each word he spoke was a tribute to their sacrifice and a signal to the world that India would no longer be sidelined in conversations about its own destiny. There is a rare kind of strength that doesn't come from dominance, but from dignity. That's what Jaishankar embodied in those seconds. Dignity that didn't apologize for its pride, dignity that didn't shrink in the presence of power, but stood firm, looked it in the eye, and spoke truth without trembling. It's a strength that grows in silence, is forged in struggle, and reveals itself in moments that require courage more than strategy. The world wasn't shaken because he insulted or accused. It was shaken because he stood tall in his truth and did not seek approval for it. There was no performance in his tone, no theatrics in his message, just pure, uncut truth, spoken by a man who knew his history, honored his culture, and understood the weight of the present. In that one moment, he didn't just speak to power, he redefined it. When Jaishankar spoke, he did not merely articulate a point of view. He rewrote a narrative that had long been shaped by others. In that one powerful sentence, he reached across time and space to reclaim a story that had often been told from the outside looking in. The colonial gaze, once so dominant in shaping perceptions of the global South, found itself suddenly and undeniably challenged. With clarity and precision, he reminded the world that India is not a chapter in someone else's history book, but the author of its own epic. He did not rage against the past. He reframed it. He did not erase what had been done, but he stripped it of its assumed permanence. The chains may have left scars, but they did not define the spirit. His words were not revenge. They were reclamation. With that statement, he did what centuries of struggle had built towards. He restored the lens through which India was seen. No longer the land to be studied, conquered, or pitied, but the land to be heard, respected, and understood on its own terms. He didn't need a megaphone because truth doesn't beg to be heard. It stands, it breathes, it echoes. That one sentence wasn't constructed to impress. It was meant to clarify. It cut through layers of assumption like a scalpel, revealing a truth long buried under the weight of foreign interpretation. There was no anger in his delivery, only a deep and unwavering knowing. The kind that comes from a lineage that has withstood invasions, famines, partitions, and revolutions, and still continues to rise with grace. He acknowledged the past not to dwell in it, but to make clear that the present is not a continuation of servitude, it is a celebration of sovereignty. And in doing so he gave language to a feeling so many had carried quietly. He spoke for every voice that had been softened to make room for foreign comfort. He spoke for every history book rewritten to glorify the oppressor and diminish the oppressed. And in that moment he turned diplomacy into poetry, diplomacy into justice. He did not argue or plead for equality. He presented it as a fact so self-evident, so powerful in its truth, that it unsettled those who had built their status on assumed superiority. That one sentence, so brief yet so bold, served as a mirror for the world. Not everyone liked what they saw in that mirror, but that discomfort wasn't his responsibility, it was theirs to confront. His words weren't just political, they were spiritual. They carried the essence of ancestors who tilled the soil and carried wisdom in their silence. They carried the voices of freedom fighters who never lived to see the India they dreamed of. They carried the prayers of mothers who sent their sons to war, and the songs of poets who kept hope alive through the darkest nights. His sentence was not born in a boardroom. It was born from the soil, from the struggle, from the soul of a people who never gave up. And perhaps what shook the world most was not what he said, but what it revealed. It revealed a shift that could no longer be ignored. That India is not seeking validation, it is setting the terms of its own presence. That it no longer wears the labels others wrote for it, but instead speaks with its own voice, loud in its quiet, proud in its peace. It was not a declaration of war, but a declaration of self. A moment where the narrative didn't just shift, it returned to its rightful owner. Jaishankar did not carry history as a burden chained to his ankles. He held it like a sword forged in resilience. In a world that often asks the once oppressed to forget, to move on, to remain silent in the name of peace, he did something far more courageous. He remembered not with bitterness, not with vengeance, but with precision. His memory was not a weapon against others. It was a shield of dignity for his people. He reminded the world that the past is not to be buried under the polished floors of global diplomacy. It is to be honored, understood, and spoken of, because only then can true progress be built. In his few words he carried centuries of resistance, of scholars who protected knowledge while empires burned, libraries, of spiritual leaders who preached peace while swords hung over their heads, of farmers who fed the nation through storms and droughts. His voice was filled with the echoes of a civilization that had been tested but never tamed. He did not use the past as a crutch, but as a compass. Each syllable pointed to a truth, that the legacy of colonization still lingers not just in lands but in language, in the subtle expectations that former colonies remain grateful, humble, and quiet. He challenged that expectation with calm boldness. There was no rage, yet his message struck deeper than anger ever could. He made it clear that India does not forget where it came from, nor does it ask permission to be proud of it. He honored the journey, the wounds and the wisdom alike, showing that remembrance is not weakness, it is power. For too long the powerful have asked the wounded to forget, while they wear their victories like medals. Jaishankar reversed that logic. He turned memory into strength. He took the very thing that was meant to be India's limitation, its colonized past, and transformed it into a foundation of pride and clarity. By referencing the past, He wasn't reopening old wounds. He was exposing the still fresh scars that many pretend no longer exist. His tone was not accusatory, it was illuminating. He didn't name names or count crimes. He simply placed truth gently on the table and waited for the world to look at it. And they did. Because truth, when spoken with dignity, is impossible to ignore. His words were not revenge, but they were reckoning. A quiet, firm refusal to let the narrative be whitewashed or distorted. He also spoke for the many who never got a chance to speak. For the voices that were silenced under colonial rule, the cultures that were labeled primitive, the leaders who were jailed or killed for dreaming too loudly. His sentence carried them all forward. It was as though he stood not alone, but with an entire history standing behind him, watching, waiting, and finally speaking through him. In that moment, he did not just represent a government. He embodied a lineage. What made it even more powerful was his restraint. He did not dwell in pain. He stood in power. He did not present the past as an excuse, but as context, a necessary foundation for honest dialogue. He showed the world that acknowledging history doesn't divide. It dignifies, and that true progress doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from confronting it with courage, clarity, and grace. He held up the sword of memory not to strike, but to carve out space. Space for India to stand, to speak, and to lead. It was a moment that reminded everyone watching that a nation's past, when honored and understood, becomes not a chain but a crown. And with that he wore it, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly where he comes from. There was no aggression in his tone, no fury in his eyes. Yet every word Jaishankar spoke landed like the quiet clap of thunder that rolls in before a storm. He didn't yell to command attention, he simply stood still and made the room listen. That's what shook the world. Not a fiery outburst, but the serene certainty of a man who knew that elegance doesn't dilute power. It sharpens it. His demeanor was not defensive or boastful, but resolute, grounded, composed. In an arena where loud voices often dominate, he became the embodiment of strength through stillness. He didn't just speak, he stood anchored in confidence that needed no validation. The beauty of that moment wasn't just in what he said, but how he said it. Every syllable was deliberate, every pause purposeful. He wasn't there to attack or humiliate. Yet, his presence unsettled those accustomed to unquestioned authority. It was as if centuries of imbalance were gently being corrected, not through protest or war, but through the unshakable grace of someone who refused to be lesser. In those 60 seconds he reminded the world that power doesn't always come in noise, it often arrives in silence that refuses to shrink. He didn't look to match the arrogance that has historically sat at the head of international forums. He didn't try to play the game by old rules that once demanded submission from nations like his. Instead, he rewrote the game with his mere posture, his tone, and his clarity. He looked power in the face not with contempt but with calm, a calm so unsettling because it exposed just how much noise had previously disguised insecurity. Where others postured, he poised. Where others dominated, he dignified. And perhaps what made it most impactful was that it wasn't a performance, it was presence. True presence. The kind that doesn't need to dominate the room because it is the room. He didn't need applause to validate his words, nor approval to legitimize his truth. There was a quiet defiance in his composure, the kind that comes from deep awareness of one's history, identity, and right to be heard. He didn't try to become someone else to fit in. He brought his full self to the table, and that alone shifted the balance. What shook the world was not the content alone, it was the delivery. That ability to correct without condemning, to speak truth without shouting, to assert without attacking. He showed the global community that India is not interested in echoing anyone's voice. It has its own tone, rhythm, and language of leadership, and that leadership doesn't mimic it, redefines. He brought with him not only centuries of cultural richness, but the weight of transformation. A once colonized nation, standing tall with its own voice, not louder but clearer. He embodied the quiet revolution of confidence, the elegance of someone who has nothing to prove but everything to offer. That's what many missed before, mistaking politeness for weakness, or humility for hesitation. But in those 60 seconds, Jaishankar made it evident that elegance and strength are not opposites. They are partners. And when combined, they don't just speak, they echo. He reminded the world that India will no longer be a silent participant in the theater of global politics. It will not accept applause for staying quiet. It will not trade its dignity for diplomacy. With poise and precision, Jaishankar became not just a speaker in that moment, but a mirror held up to the world, one that showed with unflinching clarity that power can wear a suit of silence and still shake the floorboards of an entire system. Jaishankar's words weren't sculpted for the camera or for the roar of the crowd. They were spoken with the solemn weight of generations whose voices were silenced, dismissed, or erased. In those 60 seconds, he didn't speak just for himself or even for a political party. He spoke for a lineage, for the unheard, the unseen, the forgotten. He gave shape to the quiet resilience of millions who had been told to wait their turn, to keep their heads down, to be grateful for scraps of recognition. He turned silence into strength, invisibility into presence. His speech didn't shout, but it roared in the hearts of those who had long wondered if their voice even mattered. For decades, the narrative had been controlled by others, those with the privilege to write history and the power to silence dissent. In classrooms and boardrooms, on international stages and in diplomatic circles, the global South had often been expected to follow, not to lead, to comply, not to confront. But in that moment, Jaishankar flipped the script. He didn't ask for validation from the West. He didn't beg for space at the table. He made it clear that the table itself was no longer owned by a few, and that India was not just a guest, it was a co-architect of the new world order. His words didn't aim to trend on social media or to stir fleeting applause. They were too intentional, too grounded, too sacred for that. He didn't perform, he revealed. What made the world pause wasn't that he said something controversial, but that he said something true. Unapologetically true. And in today's world, truth, especially when spoken by those historically sidelined, has the power to shake empires. He reminded the children of colonized lands that their identity is not a footnote, but a headline. That they don't need to mimic accents or suppress their history to be taken seriously. That their stories are not secondary, they are central to the world's understanding of justice, resilience, and progress. His message carried a quiet rebellion that pride in one's roots is not nationalism, it is healing, it is reclamation, it is necessary, and that you can speak from your cultural soul without compromise and still command the attention of the globe. For every young person who has walked into a room and felt the weight of being underestimated, overlooked, or unheard, his words offered a kind of liberation, a reminder that their voice too matters, that clarity doesn't require aggression, that power doesn't need permission to be exercised. His 60-second statement was not a burst of inspiration, it was a declaration of arrival, not arrival in the sense of arrival on someone else's terms, but the full arrival of self, of story, of sovereignty. He showed that leadership is not just about economic strength or military might. It's about authenticity, about knowing who you are, where you come from, and why you refuse to shrink to fit into spaces that were never designed with you in mind. And in doing so, he didn't just speak for India. He spoke for every voice that has been told to wait, to soften, to assimilate. He turned the weight of history into a platform of pride and made it known that the time of silence is over. His words left a mark not because they were rehearsed, but because they were real. They were born of experience, lifted by courage, and carried by hope. A hope not of fitting into the old systems, but of building new ones where truth is spoken not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's necessary.